The United States of America, a country that symbolizes an ideal that anything is possible for every man. A place where hard work leads to a good life, the American dream. It's a country with a foundation of fighting the good fight on behalf of allies as well as ourselves. Americans understand the meaning of humanity and integrity and honor. But the history of this country also has a dark side.
This is an area where the United States, frankly, has a great deal to be ashamed of.
A dark side that includes broken promises.
It happened because of greed.
A history of exploitation and corruption.
In Oklahoma in particular, the corruption was widespread.
A story that to this day, some people would like to keep in the shadows.
These aren't things that we usually learn in school.
With several generations of Americans still feeling the impacts, the time has come to illuminate the tragedy of broken trust, because only awareness will help forge a better future.
The issue is, do we learn from our mistakes?
Learning from the past without dwelling on the past is a tricky conundrum. Never more so than for Native American nations, as they reflect on what has, at times, been a strained relationship with the United States government, in terms of broken treaties, broken promises, and trust mismanagement.
I would describe it as a tragedy for tribes and tribal citizens, of course, but also a tragedy for the United States.
But there are still tremendous, tremendous problems in the federal government's relationship to the tribes.
Oklahoma's 39 federally recognized Indian nations have 39 unique stories of conflict, struggle, success, and survival. The Chickasaw and Choctaw nations share threads of a common history. As part of the Five Tribes, they were forced by the U.S. government to leave their homelands east of the Mississippi River, promised sovereignty in a new homeland, never to be part of any state, a territory that would later become the state of Oklahoma. But the betrayal wouldn't end there, and while no one wants to dwell on painful events in American history, awareness is the only way to maintain our country's values of honor, integrity, and justice.
3 cheers for the sovereign republic of the United States! Hip hip! Huzzah! Huzzah! Huzzah!
It's very hard to imagine the United States not as it is right now. The country not taking up the amount of land that it takes up, not being as powerful in the world as we are now. But at that point, 1776, moving on up to 1812, the United States was young and fragile. Not all tribes in the area of the Southeast allied with the United States, but the Chickasaw Nation did.
As business people, we were inclusive. We embraced the idea of new cultures and what they had to offer and what we might have to offer them.
And we actually fought in the War of 1812 side by side with Andrew Jackson.
Andrew Jackson desperately needed our help during the War of 1812. And we agreed to help him because we supported the United States.
So imagine 1812 to 1815, fighting alongside Andrew Jackson, forging these friendships and relationships, only a decade later to find Andrew Jackson in the presidency, promoting the Indian Removal Act.
President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act into law on May 28, 1830, authorizing the forced relocation of the sovereign and well-established Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole nations from the southern region of the United States.
The Indian Removal Act passed by one vote in Congress. So this wasn't a unanimous expression of congressional action. Jackson was also a very, call it, nationalistic president. And the fact that you had these sovereign entities, these tribal nations in U.S. territory, evidently offended him deeply.
And so it was all the more painful betrayal for us.
The Five Tribes were, contrary to some view, they were doing very well where they were.
They were well established, and they had been in that part of the country for years. The traditional people certainly believed that they had been there since creation, and there was no reason for them to leave. This was their land, their relatives were buried there, their sacred sites were there.
By 1832, Choctaws had already experienced devastating removal procedures. Some Cherokees, for example, and Choctaws were just herded into wagons like cattle and started off with whatever the clothes were on their backs.
There are recorded instances of some of the Choctaw parties having to travel through miles of waist-high water, breaking through the ice as they went. There are also recorded instances of murder happening on the trail.
Settlers plundered their homes and began pillaging their graves. These were brutal, brutal conditions. From the moment of the passage of the Indian Removal Act, people swooped in like vultures on to prey upon this land and to get whatever they could for themselves at that time.
And you see a series of treaties from the mid-1820s into the mid-1830s where the United States makes promises to the tribes, unlike the promises made to any other Indian tribe in any other treaty. They make a promise that the land would be their permanent homeland, a promise of almost absolute sovereignty, that the land would never be part of any state, that they would never be subject to the laws of any state.
The tribe, I think, had a legitimate treaty that they had enacted with the federal government in good faith, and they assumed that they would be holders of that land as a sovereign tribal nation into the future.
Communal fee, the highest form of ownership in U.S. law. One of the promises, famously, that President Jackson made was that the lands would be theirs for as long as the grass grows and the river flows.
So the tribes rebuilt farms, businesses, townships, schools, governing systems, laws. What the Chickasaws and Choctaws were able to rebuild in Indian Territory in such a short time is absolutely, stunningly remarkable.
They had this promise, they had this piece of paper that said, you're never going to be part of another state or territory. Well, that changed dramatically after the Civil War as westward expansion, pressure from the railroads, business organizations to open Indian Territory to white settlement.
Civil War was in fact fought in Indian Territory. None of the tribes in Indian Territory had a stake in the Civil War, but could not be free from it.
Because the Confederacy tended to control Oklahoma, that was seen as an excuse to say, well, the tribes sided with the Confederacy, so we should hurt them. We should take some of their land away.
And after the Civil War, when railroads entered the Choctaw Nation, they brought more and more non-Indians who came illegally.
Then you start to see some of the same things that played themselves out in our homelands play themselves out in Indian Territory.
But the pressures in Indian Territory at the time of the allotment period were so intense. The number of white settlers was so much greater than the number of the Indian tribal members themselves.
Indian policy became more of an opportunity to assimilate Indian people into the larger culture.
The Dawes Commission had come out here in 1893 to begin the process of trying to implement an allotment system.
The purpose of the allotment and assimilation era was to break up the tribal landmass and distribute communally held lands to individual Indians and individual families.
Then, when allotment began, the only recourse that tribal governments had was to make the best of a bad situation and try to negotiate the best deal they could, because it was going to happen.
Well, I think Henry Dawes himself described how he had been to the Indian nations, and he had seen that these people had their own schools, they had their own hospitals, they took care of their own. There was not any obvious poverty or need in the nation. And then he goes on to declare that the Indians were doing well, but that they would never progress any further. They did not have any incentive to better themselves over their neighbors. They lacked that one quality that was the kind of hallmark of civilization and progress, i.e., human greed.
That was one of the sort of death knells, and then the 1906 Five Tribes Act. That was the act that was intended to wrap up the affairs of the Five Tribes.
Looking at the fraud after the Allotment Act and how land speculators and guardians, were really exploiting even the individual allotment lands of Choctaws. This is a very corrupt system.
Tribal people here in Oklahoma were swindled out of lands. I've heard many stories of how this happened.
It happened because of greed. As the potential of those vast amounts of natural wealth were found, conspiracies continued.
The timber was another resource that the Choctaw Nation tried to preserve from allotment. But the timber was particularly vulnerable because there is one government account of how many, predators, if you will, people just coming in and cutting large sections of forest land without permission.
And in the United States Congress at the time, timber and railroad companies had extreme power. In order to build railroads, you needed timber, and cedar was the timber used to create railroad ties.
There was a real scandal, especially here in Oklahoma.
The history of fraud in Indian Territory at the time of allotment is thoroughly documented. And it's not even a question. That's not up for debate.
This is not a good or a positive period of history for our state or for the United States. Of course, this policy was disruptive. It was even genocidal. If you look at how one might dismantle a culture, you would break up their language. You would take away their social structure, their power system, their architecture, their religion. And if you look at what happened during the allotment and assimilation era, there's no doubt that all of those things were targeted.
So Indians were cheated. The courts themselves did not spend time. We didn't have public defenders in those days. The Department of Interior or Indian Affairs didn't do its job. And so there was really no one to defend the tribes.
And there's no question that there were plenty of people who saw it as a great opportunity for a new land grab.
Most people point to the Trail of Tears and Removal as sort of like the most tragic chapter in our history. And it was absolutely tragic. But the piece of our history that breaks my heart wide open, statehood. Nothing breaks my heart like that. Because you're stripped of a way to fight back. The new Indian wars were on paper.
First of all, the objective of federal policy for the last half of the 19th century was to get as much Indian land as possible, regardless of what promises had been made before, regardless of the treaties, regardless of the agreements, regardless of whatever Indian rights might have existed.
That policy of allotment and assimilation was the dominant policy, again, from the 1870s until it was repudiated in 1934. In 1928, after a 2-year study, they concluded that allotment and assimilation were a total failure, that they destroyed tribal landowning. Those policies created widespread poverty, and they expropriated lots of tribal lands. But there's no doubt that there was widespread failure of the United States to protect tribal rights that they promised to protect.
For the people of Southeast Oklahoma, nothing says home more than the dense timberlands that have provided habitat, recreation, and economic survival for generation upon generation of local residents.
Timber is critical to the local economy for the last at least 100 years.
Ivan Batiste grew up near the banks of what locals call Coon Creek in McCurtain County. He isn't sure how many hands the land passed through or how much money others have made from his family's allotment. He knows his family didn't profit. But that isn't what haunts him today. It's a memory from his childhood. A young Ivan not able to protect his grandmother when the timber man came calling.
I was about 9 years old. I still remember that day that she wanted some money to buy something.
Ivan says he remembers she needed $65. And conveniently, that's the price the timberman was willing to pay. However, while his grandmother thought she was selling only a few trees, she unknowingly sold the rights to cut unlimited timber.
Log trucks come by daily for a whole year. And I noticed he bought him a house and maybe 2 trucks and a car and a boat. I remember that. And just signing a contract that she couldn't read or write.
U.S. land disbursements through allotment also forced tribal citizens into a system of taxation that was foreign to them, and stories of tax sales or property seizures are common.
Especially back then, there was not a really good way to notify the landowners. Now you must start paying taxes. So the taxes didn't get paid. And the next thing you know, they no longer owned it.
Add to that language barriers and an ineffectual and out-of-reach legal system for tribal citizens, and you have an era where lands were ripe for the picking.
You don't have to go very far. You can just ask people on the street. You won't ask more than 3 before they can tell you the story of their grandma losing her place by not knowing that the taxes were due, or some method of hook or crook that so much of it was taken from them.
Even more disturbing are the stories that indicate the U.S. government could have been a willing participant in taking from the poor to give to the rich.
From what I know, it was definitely complicit.
And it didn't matter whether you were talking about the Indian office in Muskogee, who were buying and selling favors and access to Indian land, or whether you talk about the politicians who were in bed with the timber interest.
They were joined in together on this.
Presley Byington says historical accounts show buying agents were set up inside the government offices in Muskogee, ready to make an offer as allottees received their land patents. And it was not uncommon for allotments to be split, some land close to where they lived, and other parcels that were, for the most part, inaccessible in timber country. Presley's grandfather told a similar story.
He got part of his allotment there where he lived, right outside of Atoka, and then he had a part of it just east of here along the Arkansas line. Back then, you didn't have vehicles. It was kind of either a covered wagon or you just rode a horse. Of course, living that far, there's no possible way that you can take care of that piece of property that's there on the Arkansas line.
I compared the original Choctaw land holdings to today's Choctaw land holdings in terms of trust lands. And in those 208 years between 1800 and 2008, the Choctaw land base had been reduced by 99.78%. So in other words, Choctaw people were living on less than 1/1000th of the land that they originally lived on.
It's a little bit of a puzzle to me personally how the tribe owned it all, and now one of the largest landholders is the federal government.
When you take the assets from a people, when you strip them of their self-government, when you make agreements with them and don't keep them, that has consequences for those alive at the time, but for those who come after, because they start life in a much less advantageous position. It's not as if these stories disappear or go away.
Even after the United States had broken its word so many times, they were still willing to forgive and move on, and the United States just stuck it to them time and time again.
Until those injustices are dealt with, then those groups don't feel fully included in modern America.
Because the wounds never stop. The wounds never stop.
In response to outcries of injustice, President Harry S. Truman oversaw the creation of the Indian Claims Commission in 1946 to hear the claims brought by Native American tribes against the U.S. government.
During the times when these sorts of claims could have been filed with the Indian Claims Commission, it was during a period of time where our leadership was appointed by the United States. And so those leaders were still subject to the authority of the United States.
And although the Indian Claims Commission Act didn't require an adversarial model, the commissioners decided to create it as an adversarial model. And the Department of Justice vigorously defended all of the actions brought by tribes as though they were a defendant rather than being trustee.
Although today the U.S. government claims the 1946 Act prohibits any tribal claims predating 1951, the cutoff date doesn't actually start until the tribes have received an accounting for their assets and funds. And to this day, that has not occurred. The Trust Reform Act of 1994 reaffirmed the government's duty to account for Indian trust funds and appointed a special trustee to oversee reforms within the Department of the Interior. It also set a clock in motion.
The statutes that came out, the Indian Trust Reform Act, placed deadlines during which we had to file a claim or forever lose it.
At issue today is approximately 1.3 million acres of timberlands that were reserved from allotment that were supposed to be held in trust for the benefit of the Choctaw and Chickasaw nations.
The saga of individually allotted tribal lands that were lost to their owners by failed government policies, in some cases fraud, little can be done to address that issue. But the tribes do have a legitimate claim to the lands that were illegally sold by the Department of Interior in violation of the specific provisions of the Five Tribes Act.
They took control of assets, both land, monetary, mineral in nature. And so what we actually want and what we are entitled to is an accounting of how those assets were managed or what happened to them if we no longer own them. In this case, the main issue is the vast timber holdings that the tribes once held. We just want to know what happened and why it happened.
There's a lot of accounting to be done and a lot of, frankly, explanations to be made. And the United States government bears an extraordinary responsibility for that.
The Ouachita National Forest, within the Choctaw Nation's boundaries, is a reminder of the vast amount of land no longer in the hands of the tribe.
They tried to take that land and put it into national forest. Good intent, benevolent, they weren't going to pay for it, and they were just arbitrarily going to take it.
Eventually, this reserved land was sold, and the funds did not go to the Chickasaw and Choctaw tribes, and there has been no accounting of what happened to the funds.
Let us begin by expressing our profound sorrow for what this agency has done in the past.
In 2000, Kevin Gover, then Assistant Secretary of the Department of the Interior, made a public apology to all Native Americans for the atrocities committed by the Bureau of Indian Affairs throughout history.
We desperately wish that we could change this history, but of course we cannot. But on behalf of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, I extend this formal apology to Indian people for the historical conduct of this agency.
Well, I was the first person with some semblance of authority for the United States to say these things. And you don't get that many chances to do something like that, so I was going to take it. It was very emotional because what I was thinking about is what was it I needed to hear when I was a child? When we think about these promises, it's well understood that the United States broke every single one of the treaties it entered into. And even though none of us had anything to do with all the things that happened in the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, the agency, the institution that we worked for, had done all of that. And that institution has an existence of its own, and that we were now responsible for it. And that meant we had an obligation to try to put things right.
And so I think, especially in the context of Indian treaties, where the United States voluntarily undertook a trust relationship with Indian tribal governments, that trustee ought to have a higher standard of behavior.
So they essentially have a conflict of interest when it pertains to Indian people or Indian tribes trying to come back and get what a just due from the federal government, because their own lawyers' first responsibility is to protect the federal government. And they very, very strongly do that against Indian tribes and Indian individuals.
And handling of its relationship with Native American nations and its trust responsibility for their property is one of the things that America ought to be embarrassed about.
Not just the Bureau of Indian Affairs, but the entire United States government. You don't get to accept the advantages you've gained from the good conduct you've engaged in over the years without also accepting the consequences of your bad conduct over the years. And we should own all of it, make it a part of our understanding of who we are, and deal with it.
Well, the great Justice Hugo Black once said in an Indian law case that great nations, like great men, should keep their word.
I think that the character of a nation is really on how it treats its most vulnerable people. And the treatment of the American Indian in the United States doesn't reflect well on the character of the United States.
The government needs to be the model here. And it needs to not say, we're not going to show you where we've screwed up. We're not going to give you your records. We're not going to be forthcoming. A trustee should be forthcoming.
The federal government took on that role. And so now this being fully accountable is just the transparency so that everybody can see what has happened. There has been no greater respecter of this area and no greater respecter of all individuals than the Choctaw Nation and Chickasaw Nation of Oklahoma. They have been here for over 200 years already. They will continue to be here for the next 200 years. And they understand better than anybody that when they have success, others have success.
I think America, in the long run, we want justice to prevail. And the country's stronger when it does.
Everybody understands that some things simply can't be undone, but the things that still can be done, the parts of the treaties that can be honored, should be honored. The parts of the other promises the United States has made should be honored.
One thing the United States can do is honor the specific provisions of the Five Tribes Act, passed in 1906 by the United States Congress. The Department of Interior willfully violated this provision and either sold to private interest or retained to their own use these valuable timberlands, which rightfully belong to the Chickasaw and Choctaw nations.
Justice is never weak versus strong. It's always right versus wrong. And we need to keep our eyes on that and try to correct things that we've done in the past that, honestly, today we would hope we would never do again.